Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Honey and Stag digital book launch with me, Dr. Jackie Collins, and behind the scenes and making all this happen, Kelly Lacey. You're very welcome to our launch here, and it is our great pleasure to welcome into the studio with us Gary Finnan, and we're here today to talk about his novel Billy Tapper Zillionaire. So welcome, Gary, and it's great to see you here on the show.
Thanks, Jackie.
Hi, it's wonderful to see you, and we should let viewers know that we are doing this transatlantic. Gary, at the moment you are coming to us from South Carolina, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Reading that you divide your time between South Carolina and California. So, and I'll be asking you a little bit about that as well. That life in two spaces over there in the States. But our main focus for our time together today is your novel, Billy Tapper Zillionaire. But before we get into those pages, I should introduce you a little bit more to the viewers and say that you are an award-winning inspirational author, a designer, an entrepreneur, and a creative expression mentor. Sounds so exciting. I have to say, I've had a wee peek at your website, and it's really thrilling. Even before getting to know you and talking today, I thought I have to just ask you some more questions about who you are and what you do. Now, just a little brief summary about the novel. A novel of adventure, of family, of coming of age, a novel set in a context that for me gave me such a jolt back to childhood and to my parents' life, even pre me coming onto the scene. So before we even talk about it, I want to thank you so much for writing a piece that really resonated. It was such a delight to get to know Billy Tapper, or Billy McTaggart as he's called, and just go on that journey with Billy. So I wonder if you would set us off, if you could tell us first and foremost, what led you to put together, this adventure, because it is an adventure as we go along with Billy. What led you to do that?
It was somewhat serendipitous. I'd written a previous book and kind of got the bug. I think everybody knows once you've started to write, there's no real reason why you want to write, but you do it.
Mhm.
And so I had this dream to write a novel. And I was actually in Las Vegas and meeting up with an old boss of mine who I worked with in London. And he happened to be traveling around the world with another couple. And there were these two very petite little people. And they were so excited to tell me their story about when he worked in the rail yards in Leeds and how he had discovered something in the rail yard without being what do you call it? Giving the story away, right?
A spoiler, yeah, no spoilers.
Spoiler.
Yeah.
Anyway, and he was such a character. So was his wife. And when I was driving back to California from Las Vegas, the whole story just popped into my head, and loosely based on no facts, as a good friend of mine likes to say. The story started there, and 7 years later, I popped the book, and there was a lot of adventures in discovering what the story was going to be. It ended up, in a lot of ways, writing itself, but that was the genesis. And unfortunately, the gentleman passed away, but I did manage to send a book to his wife just after it was published, and they got the dedication in the front of the book, which was kind of cool.
That is beautiful. And what you say about that, how inspiration can come in so many different forms and in places and at times. You say you'd written before that. If you could tell us, when did you actually start writing fiction? Because have you always been a writer, or did this come a little bit later, in your journey?
Um, to write a novel came later. I didn't have the guts or the courage, maybe whichever way you want to put it,
Mhm.
capability. One of the largest things about writing this book was the learning curve. I'm really excited. I've got two follow-ups, two following Billy Tapper books that are
Excellent.
in process at the moment, and but I really stumbled into it. And so I'd written for years. And in my other book, which was a philosophical parable about a hedgehog that wants to write, and we'll be talking about that at another point, I started to write what I call ramblings and just
Mm.
small pieces of stuff. And whenever I, I often work on writing retreats with groups now, and that's how I try to introduce people into writing. Just write little things, and little things become pages, and pages become chapters, chapters becomes books, and that's how I write. And Billy was really an expression that I didn't know that I had in me, and it's been really fun to see how people receive it. That's one of my greatest pleasures, is if I've done the right job and people engage with the characters, they start to talk about them and they're real. I don't know if you had it. I'm sure you have, where you want to get home to finish the next part of the book, because of any book,
Mhm.
because it's like that life is going on without you, and you're like, what are they doing? What are
Mhm.
they up to? I want to get back to figure out.
Mhm.
That's fundamentally how I try to write. No great capability, skill, or whatever. It was just trying to create that feeling. And you get bit by the bug, I think, really.
Mhm. And I hear very much what you're saying, because I think that happens, in this novel, that you really want to see physically where Billy's going, because this is very much a physical journey, but you also want to see where he's going emotionally and mentally, decisions that he takes, attitudes that he has. Um, and again, I know it's said a lot about books, you could see a book being adapted, but this really, you could see people wanting to either binge watch if it were a Netflix series, or if it was a good old fashioned going from week to week, like, what's the next installment? What's going to happen to this guy? So I think you very much, achieved that effect on the reader. You certainly did on this one, anyway. Um, so the notion of the wheel tapper, and of course, as you say, inspired by somebody that you met in real life. But for anybody, I would say, especially of a certain age, because it made it made me think of, I don't know if you remember that TV program, that entertainment program. I think it was on a Saturday night, the Wheel Tappers and Shunters Club.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
stumbled on that when I was doing research. Yeah.
Yeah, and I so wonder, could you tell us what is a wheel tapper?
So the well, the wheel tapper up until um, uh, 19. Hold on a minute, I've got my date. 1970. Sorry,
Mhm.
jumping around there. But up until 1970, they existed, and they basically, from the beginning of railroads, the wheels on trains were made from cast iron, and so they were delicate. And so when the train would pull into a station, the wheel tapper literally would go and tap the wheels with a very special long-handled hammer. And if it pinged, it was good. If it clunked, it had a crack, and it was defective. So in many ways, and so this was right up until the beginning of the 70s, and then obviously things changed, and that's a part of what this book transitions
Mhm.
through, from steam to space rockets.
Mhm.
But what was really great and what came out of this was the metaphoric aspect of tapping. And on the front of the cover, I have it where on iron wheels, the tapper's hammer rings true or broken, a metaphor for a life revealed. And that's what Billy does. And, these are some of the fun things that I don't think you can really take credit for it. They kind of
Mhm.
evolve out of a book by themselves. But that's what Billy does. He's constantly testing and tapping. aspects of his life to see what rings true for him, or what in fact rings broken. And he has a fair share of them.
Yeah, and talking about then, him as that tapper, and a tapper in his own life and a tapper in other people's lives. There's very much that generational sense to the novel, in particular, because there's various characters that I would like us to talk in depth about, but I wonder if we could first and foremost talk about his mum.
Or his man. Yeah.
Yeah, or his mum, as we should say. And for viewers watching around the world, his mom. But yeah, it's all in a vowels change. You know, again, your inspiration for this character, because I don't know how long you managed to talk to the gentleman that the character's based on. So, who is his mum, and what's your view on her? How do you see this character?
Um, she stands for everything that is at the core of who we are. She's a gentle soul. She's a misunderstood soul. She's a misfortunate soul. But whatever happens, she maintains her elegance in her working class way. And I think that what's really interesting for Mam is she comes through. She does get her moment in the sunshine, which is really a very. I've got to apologize. My dog just crept in and is sitting here drinking water. I don't know if you can hear that, but I tell. I'm sorry, I'm distracting. Anyway, but she, in many ways, she carries the good throughout the book. And she's everybody's mother, everybody's granny. In many ways, she doesn't get to be a granny, unfortunately, but she really carries the weight of working class women, how they were looked down upon, how they were expected to feed the family, and basically take the weight. She also gave me an opportunity, and this, there are statements or positions in the book that have kind of an underlying comment to them, but particularly with Mam, she was impregnated at a very young age with Billy's dad, but they didn't know that it was he went off to the war, and she was taken in by the Magdalene sisters. And for me, that's always been a really, really painful part of history. That ironically, I met a woman in California who was a social worker, because the Magdalene sisters weren't disbanded until 1990, which started in the 1700s or something like that. And so I wanted to kind of share that pain that so many women, working class women, carried for hundreds of years. And so anyway, she personifies that, but she's also beautiful and heartfelt.
Yeah, that great sense of a strength of character that very often, you mentioned, that working class woman who, against all odds and in all situations, is that beacon of strength and hope and determination. And yeah, lovely character, and we'll come back to some of the other characters as well to talk about. But I think it would be a good moment in our discussion if you take us into the text and give us our first slice of Billy Tapper Zillionaire.
Okay, so I thought, why not start at the beginning? Because in so many ways, this personifies the beginning of Billy's journey. So excuse my reading capabilities. God save the Queen, thought Billy as he pulled an 8-inch crowbar from the poacher's pocket of his donkey jacket. He wedged the crowbar between the padlock and the door of the freight wagon. Pop. The tunnel in which he stood cut as deeply into the Saddleworth Moor in the West Riding of Yorkshire as the gash from the dull edge of the padlock that now ran to the knuckle bone in his right hand. The pain shot up his arm and out of his mouth in a hiss that threatened to become a scream of spit and profanity. Blood dripped down the cold steel on the crowbar onto the oily puddle around his workbook on the dirty gravel that banked against the wooden sleeper of the rail track. He cast the yellow beam of his paraffin lamp across the ragged wound that thought and thought again to curse aloud. He imagined the echo of his voice bouncing in the darkness on stone walls out towards the arched speck of light which framed the first of the freight wagons he had counted on his way into the tunnel. Blimey, that's a bad one, I'll wager, he said with restraint, stoically pushing aside the throbbing pain. Another one for the yard, he mumbled, wiping a smear of blood up the side of his thin face and sharp nose as he pushed back a flop of dark, greasy hair. Best get a move on, Billy boy, before you either freeze to bloody death or they'll all be playing tiddlywinks by the time you get back to the tea shed. He slid the crowbar back into his work jacket and kicked the broken padlock against the tunnel wall. Then turning his attention to ripping a strip of cloth from the bottom of his undershirt using his teeth and an uninjured hand. His exposed skinny belly dimpled in goose flesh against the cold as he pulled the cloth loose and wrapped the wound. He looked at his hand and realized they had taken a fair beating in the last few years since becoming an apprentice tapper.
Thank you, Gary.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction to Billy, and again that reflection on what he's been through. Now, if we can just focus a little bit more on Billy, and I wondered in the process of bringing him to page and sending him on that journey, was there at any point where he just didn't seem to develop that character?
I have to say no, because it's funny. We play this game with friends of mine who have read the book, and we'll have a few beers or glasses of wine, and we'll sit round and we'll talk about the characters. And it's a game we play in a sense of all their lives are still alive and still happening. If you asked me any question, what's Billy doing today, and give me some context, I'll tell you. And so that's how I write. I live like a fly on the shoulder, and I just watch. And so the story kind of tells itself. And Billy has always been alive. Every one of the characters for me are alive and functioning, and they're still alive today. They're still living their story. So anytime I would stop and think about what is Billy doing today, the answer would pop up. And so he's alive. He's not a figment of my imagination. He exists. If that makes sense. He's still doing stuff right now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that a character isn't just a description on a page, but there is so much more going on. Now the story begins in the northwest of England, and as we talked before going on air, I feel very much that Gary has been writing my life story, because when we come back in a week's time and we talk about your other novel, again, I really felt your words were speaking to me. But so the northwest of England, you could have chosen anywhere. I think in the north, to write this story. Your inspiration was from Leeds, but you chose the northwest. Why was that?
My sister lives in Diggle.
Ah!
It's not that complicated. And so I've been there more than a few times, and Diggle has a beautiful railroad that runs through the middle of it and has a lot of history. And the Diggle Hotel sits up on the hill, and Saddleworth is there. And I've spent as much time roaming around those hills and along the railroad tracks. And again, serendipitously, it was like, how could it not be? It was it was the place. It just had to be the place. I didn't overthink it.
Yeah. But, and again, without giving too much away of the story, Billy travels, and Billy travels actually to the US. And am I right in remembering rightly? There's a trip to Hawaii. We've got the Grand Canyon and San Francisco, and I wonder to what extent at that point in the history of a working class ordinary lad making that kind of trip. I mean, even now making that kind of trip is pretty momentous. But for Billy, what I mean, how different would that have been?
So here's an interesting aspect to this. First and foremost, every story in the book is true. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. With some arms and legs and names and places changed to save the innocent, right?
Mhm.
but you know, I'm 55 and I've traveled. I've been lucky, and I was that little boy in Dundee in Scotland, right, where
Mm.
they gave me three options when I left school. You know, Navy body recovery diver, trash collector, or military policeman, and luckily I haven't had to do any of those. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but
Mhm.
I've been very fortunate. And so there's I did have one person write a review who loved the book but couldn't get their head around the famous person that Billy met and saved his
Mm.
life, which it's the other piece I'm going to read.
Mm.
Um, but this is a book about hope. I think about Forrest Gump, right? You watch
Mm.
that movie, the probability of Forrest Gump doing any of the things that he did is what made it the movie. So there is probability. There are people who go out in the world, and you want to see what Billy gets up to in the next two books. It's interesting. But the reality is that I also want to show people that there is a way out. There is a way forward, and particularly growing up in Scotland, I grew up, you know, in the back of Dundee,
Mhm.
where I was told that there wasn't a way out. I was lucky. We went to Africa, you know, South Africa. You know, I then never came home, never went back. Um, so I'm a great believer. I tell my daughter just came back from Africa. She was teaching, she was coaching anti-poaching
Mm.
teams. She's a master dog trainer.
Mm.
And the reason she's there is because we let her believe that she can be there. And
Mm.
so there is no, you know, I've been very fortunate. I believe I want to inspire other people, and there isn't a no as to why you can't. So Billy, in many ways, and even his story, personifies the thresholds that I think we have to push ourselves against, the tests, and people who don't, I think they live lesser lives for it. So the reason it's a coming of age story is because everything is possible,
Mm.
whether that's going somewhere, being something, um, who you love, how you experience life, what you eat, you know, all that stuff. I once worked in Hong Kong, and I took a lad from Blackburn who was working with me in South Africa, and I took him to Hong Kong for a project. And we had to ship in Heinz beans for him because he wouldn't eat anything else. Oh no, I can't eat that, you know. And we were sitting in some of the most gorgeous restaurants with the best food in the world. And so anyway, I always laugh because that Billy can for exactly, and but he has to work really hard to make it happen. You
Mm.
know, he has to think because it's his dream. You know, what do you do? How hard do you work to fulfill your dream until
Mm.
it happens?
Mm.
That makes,
And
yeah,
and yeah, I mean, a sense of possibility, a sense that all is possible. But the other part of that equation, I think, is Billy's drive to achieve that. Yeah, I think that's really important, and taking advantage of what luck befalls him.
right. Well, you know, there's a saying that, you know, luck, it depends how hard you're working. You know what I mean? The harder you work, the luckier you get, right?
Mm.
And he does have a windfall, but how
Mm.
he chooses to do that, and this is another moral aspect of the story. Um, he doesn't do it selfishly. Maybe initially, but he also is pushed on by Meg, who I'm sure
Mm.
we'll chat about,
Mm.
um, who was a difficult character to write because I needed someone that pushed him, but at the same time people might not like or love. And her manipulation in the story is equally what drives him on, his motivation, and then it actually flips his motivation. So it's kind of interesting.
Mm. Yeah, and well, let's do it. Because you've brought up this character, Meg, because through her, I think you provide a really interesting study of attraction, where relationships go when they start at a very early age, how they can develop. You mentioned that manipulation. I don't want to call it game playing because I don't think it is. I wonder, is it just characters, like rubbing against each other along the way? You say none of this story is fabricated, so I dread to think who Meg is based on. and do they know it? But for the viewers, explain to us how they meet, and maybe Meg's motivations.
So how they meet's one of my favorite parts of the book. And I originally, when I was writing it, it was the opening chapter, which I still, I still think it's one of the best chapters in the book. And all of the characters are a combination of character, of people, and story. And so Meg, in many ways, represents the light at the window for Billy. She without her, he wouldn't have become what he became, and in many ways. And but she represents another aspect. She's maybe the opposite of the young man who if things had been different, life might have turned out differently. But my favorite, back to the favorite part of the story there, again, is based on a true story that my dad's wife, not my mother, but my dad's wife, actually told me the story about the big blue knickers and trying to steal the tea set. Right? For those of you don't, if you don't know, she, after the war, there was not a lot of toys for the kids, and she fell in love with this beautiful Mickey Mouse tin tea set that had come over from America. And she tried to steal it by shoving it in her knickers and trying to sneak it out of the class. You remember those big blue knickers?
I do really well, yeah.
Yeah. I never wore them, just to be clear. But anyway, yeah. Why front? She kept losing the toys out the front. But anyway, but it's just a true story, and obviously expanded upon it. But it also gave me the opportunity to talk about corporal punishment growing up in schools. I don't know, the strap, the ruler. When I moved to South Africa, I used to get the cane. So people don't, of a certain generation now, don't know that, and they haven't necessarily been through that. So I wanted to equally show the harshness of the rote education, the tarmac in the playground, the ruler across the knuckles, and still show a little light, a sign of light at the end of the day. And it also gave me a really good opportunity for Meg's character to come through, where she basically swears at Billy when he's mesmerized and falls, and he falls very early and very hard for her. So it's the beginning of a love story that lasts for 2, maybe 3 books.
Yeah. And do you know, that is one thing that struck me by the end of the book, and given the things that they go through, that the way that he still looks at her,
Right.
that there's still so much love despite everything. And I feel that is, that is one of the beautiful things about the novel, that says, that love is not a thing that is easily blown away.
Right.
That the durability that it can withstand, and to me, it speaks very much, in the face of, I don't know, because I don't want to sound like an old woman here, but that notion that love is all froth and is all wonderment, and then when it's not, then it no longer exists. their love seems to have been built on something immensely solid, or that's what it felt like.
It's their commonality, their roots, and they never lose that. Funny, I was writing the third book. I was writing the first chapter of the third book, um, Billy Tapper Solitaire, and as you guess by the title, he's on his own, but he has this drive to get back to Diggle, and that's what Meg represents to him. Is she is everything about who he is, where he comes from, and they have a shared common element to them. But there's another aspect to the book that is really important because Billy has another love in the book that I'm sure we'll talk about. But the aspect of this book, he taps against himself to understand his own sense of self-love, and that's a theme that I like to put into my writing, is because if you don't understand who you are within yourself, and we often bumble along on that journey until we have that epiphany where we go, oh my God, that's where I stand in context to it. And people don't, some people never do it. Some people live gloriously in it. But until you live in your full expression and your full you mentioned at the beginning, I teach creative expression, and I do it for individuals, professionals, and corporate groups. It's about going, this is what brings me alive. This is what being wholehearted is all about. And Billy eventually gets to that where he suddenly realizes who he is in context to the rest of the world. And I think those are the epiphany moments, and you've got to have a catalyst for that. So Billy has a couple of catalysts who help him reveal himself. And Meg is obviously, Meg, Mam, and the other characters are all actors in that play of him going, oh, that's who I am. That's what I stand for. That's what I believe. That makes sense. Yeah.
It really does. It really does. Gary, would you do us the honours of giving us the next piece from the book?
Yeah, and which is probably a good one as a precursor to talking about Billy's other love. So as you mentioned, Billy goes to Hawaii after orchestrating a charity win that gets him there because, obviously a tapper from Diggle isn't going to have enough money to go and see a concert in in Hawaii. So he orchestrates a very elaborate scheme that gets him there. And so this is just after him and Meg have arrived and they've got settled in the hotel, and he decides to go out and peruse the great American dream that he's always dreamed of. Billy took a seat at the counter. A man next to him sat slumped over his coffee, looking disheveled in a light raincoat, a baseball cap, and bold sunglasses. The man ordered a fried peanut butter and bacon sandwich with extra banana and another coffee. He kept his voice low and seemed to want to be left alone. Billy was impressed. God bless America, assuming Hawaii was an American state, though he wasn't sure about that. He felt sure no one in Diggle would think of frying peanut butter, bacon, and banana, though God knows they love to fry food back home. Nothing so stodgy as pie and gravy, black pudding, rag or Yorkshire pudding. Black rag or Yorkshire pudding could compete with a bloody fried peanut butter, bacon, and banana sandwich. I'll have one of those as well, please, and a cup of tea, miss, and put this order on my tab. He gestured at the slumped man. He looks like he's a little out of luck. The man grunted thank you, his thick greasy hair pushed out over his oversized glasses, which themselves peeked out below a ratty Caesar's Palace baseball cap. The man's food arrived, and he eagerly stuffed half the sandwich into his face, almost ravenous, grease running to his cuffs. Glorious, thought Billy. I love America. I'm from England, a tourist here. He extended his hand, but the man was too busy with his sandwich to free up a hand to shake. My name's Billy McTaggart. Oh, a tourist? The stranger grunted between bites of his sandwich. Aye, I am. What about you, big man? The man didn't answer, but stood up, reeled around, heaving, his hands clenched at his throat, and passed out face down on the greasy diner linoleum floor. Billy jumped up and rolled the man over. His skin was a shade of blue through his dark, day-old facial hair. Standard safety training was required for all employees at the British Midland Rail, including emergency medical training, and Billy moved through the motions of clearing the air passage and was just about to consider mouth-to-mouth resuscitation when the man coughed and took a deep breath. A moment later, the dazed, rasping man sat on the floor looking at him through bloodshot eyes. Billy stared at him, shocked, and was about to inquire if he might be the king when the ambulance arrived in a flash. Billy watched him disappear into the ambulance. Only a lump of half-chewed sandwich lay on the floor.
Oh, Gary, what a beautiful historical moment, and what a life changing, defining moment for Billy as well. You make a number of references throughout the book, special musical connections, and the king being one of them, important to Billy. Elvis Presley important to you?
Yeah, I love dancing. I try to sing, and who can't, sing and dance to Elvis? And I remember the day he died. I think it was 76 or something like that as a kid.
Yep.
But he's eternal, and my wife loves him when he's wearing all the black leather gear in Las Vegas. But he kind of, again, is just, I don't know where it came from. Where that came from in the story, but if you're going to go big, and there's nobody bigger than the king, right? I've got everybody in the world who was through these beautiful musical genres of, from Nat King Cole, to the Beatles, to and that's a theme that carries all the way through. And it's one of the things, when you talk about who was Mam, my mum comes to mind for me. She died a long time ago, but she introduced me to, and that's an aspect of Mam that comes through. She introduced me to Nat King Cole. Sorry, brain here. Nat King Cole, Barbra Streisand. All great musicals, all those things. And so that's why music for me just tells a story. And originally in this book, at the beginning of every chapter, I actually had a piece of poetry that I turned into a song that was supposed to be the genre of the chapter or the time period. And I think in the Wyoming part with Lola, who I'm sure we'll talk about, the song that she sings in there, it's very brief, but I wrote the song completely, and I have no musical capability at all. But I hired a band to play at a party at my house, and I said, "Can you help me with this?" And so we went into the studio and produced a full song. And I wanted to do that for every chapter in the book until somebody told me I was mad, and an editor said people don't do that. And I was like, okay, that's another whole subject, right? But if you're gonna, the music aspect of going through this book, everyone has a song for a time period in their life, and that's what I tried to evoke. That there are songs that just resonate, and how can you go through this great period of history without going through these great periods of music?
That's what I really felt as well. The artists that were mentioned are very much artists that defined a generation or defined a movement or a style of music. So, there was very much a place to hang this story. To me, it deserved a soundtrack. Almost that, if it were financially viable, to say that, you buy this novel, and you get a CD with X number of tracks on it that just set you in the mood and create the time back then. So, there were times when I was reading that I ended up humming a tune from back then, and being really transported. So, so not just text, but also music, which was great.
Yeah, one of the things with that is that's why we need Netflix to pick it up so they can pay for the music to put into the you know
Yes.
it's funny because so many probably 50% of the reviews that I get, they want to see it as a TV series or see it.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
one of my favorite TV series is Peaky Blinders,
Hmm. Yeah.
and there's just a feel to it, and in my own mind, and so on my Instagram page and stuff like that, I create these vignettes, and I have a friend of mine who works in Hollywood, and he basically said to me, create imagery around the story, and so I take these vignettes of the story and I'll put 4 pictures together, and so it's on my Instagram page, and they really in 4 or 5 pictures you can see the chapter and it will tell you the story. So whether it's Devil's Mountain in Wyoming, or a Las Vegas showgirl, or Apollo landing on the moon, or a tapper standing next to a big train, or a bunch of children who are being evacuated out of Manchester during the Blitz, music, pictures, and story, bringing, it's a multimedia exercise that I
Hmm.
think can only really happen in cinema or on TV, and that would be great. Who wouldn't want that, right?
I totally. And again, it brings me back to what you said earlier about the whole notion of possibility, you know,
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
the why not, and believing in the why not. And there was something else, if you'll just allow me to read something
sure.
when we were talking earlier. I love this about what is clearly your ethos, and it clearly comes out in your writing, and I took this from your website, where it says, in truth, there is one thing I am passionate about, and that is the creative expression.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so, this book, and then next week when we talk about Hector, these books speak to the creative expression, and definitely, that resonance that's there, of the passion that is within you to put these ideas on a page, but not just put these ideas on a page, that they go beyond. And so, as you were saying, about the music, about the events of a time, that they're there. However, before we come to the third reading that I hope you've got for us, I do have to ask you about a couple of tricky things,
Yes.
if that's all right. Those tricky things being the sex scenes and the obscenities that that are there on the page, and I wonder, to what extent did you have any sort of like internal conflict about, how do I describe these things that are happening? Do I want to put them in the text? And then, have you had any sort of, I don't want to say negative, but feedback where maybe for certain readers that's been a little bit too much?
Um, I have a neighbor who is a very devout woman, and she said, loved the book, didn't need the profanity, but liked it anyway.
Mm.
And so, um, you know, the book was a lot more raunchy. And if there was something, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it was a lot more raunchy, and it got edited back, and it was part of the learning exercise for me. But what I learned in doing that was I was trying to write to shock. I wasn't trying to write better.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
so in my journey, I learned what that was. But you know what? Um, the book comes from a raw place.
Yes.
It's a working man's book.
Mhm.
It starts off, and so without getting into the details of it, someone tried to tell me alternate names for mentioning someone's manhood, and which and I said, well, just let's stop for a second and think about a tapper in a tea hut in Diggle on
Yeah.
the railroads saying, "Oh, let me tell you about my." It doesn't work, right?
No,
There's reason
not at all.
it's there, And then there's also I wanted the visceral aspect of it to show the passion. By page 12, they're having what we call a knee trembler.
Mm.
That's cultural. It's how it happens. It's how. So I don't want to ever lose that. And then everything, I've recently been writing a lot of erotic poetry, but it's set based in a sensual aspect of things, not to try and be rude or naughty. But it's about sensuality. And
Mm.
and hopefully before we finish up, I really would like to talk about Lola,
Mm.
who is Billy's muse, and she gives him his biggest awakening of his life, and so and by the time Billy gets to his relationship with her, he's learned a different finesse. He's learned a gentleness. He's learned how to reveal himself instead of just being a fumbling, bumbling young man to somebody who becomes a lover,
Mm.
if that
Mm.
makes sense. And we all go through that journey.
A very good question, and I think that you posit that, and as as the reader going through that, and I mean, and is it a thing of the time of the book, 1950s, 1960s, working class, northern, not having a vocabulary for things, and not having books, films, internet, anything like that to explain things, to gain a deeper understanding. I wonder if you were to write Billy of, the 1990s and the early noughties, would that have been the same? Even putting him in the same location and the same circumstances?
Certainly not. But Billy does go through the present day, and he still will retain his characteristics.
Mm.
I think the F word is one of the best things around. Uh, you know,
But don't say it on this, please.
no, that's why I said I didn't say it. I really held back on a lot of things already. Anyway, the point being is yeah, we have expressions of our times, and something that you made me think of while you were talking there was equally I show an emotional and sophistication and evolution of Billy. He moves from being a tapper to being an office clerk. He moves from being an office clerk to being a businessman, entrepreneurial. He has this great charitable characteristic of him,
Mm.
and he moves into the future where he's suddenly intrigued with the NASA moon landings, and you go, hold on, that's as juxtaposed to meeting Elvis, to him meeting Elvis as it is to him being interested in that. But we all do. Most of us, if we look back and we think about when we were kids to where we are now and how we emotionally, mentally, everything, we evolve. And it's how we choose to evolve, and it's how we choose to learn. So back to the creative expression piece, what brings you alive, and I find that if you're curious and you go out into the world, you'll be surprised what you find there, and invariably it will change you, and
Mm.
those paths that you take will be the ones that will make a difference. So that's what living is all about.
Mm. Mm. And I'm thinking of potential as well. That idea of, just because you begin your life in a certain place with certain circumstances, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is forever your lot. Um, Billy seems very much to demonstrate that. But please, could we have our third reading? And then I
Oh,
promise
sure.
you, we're gonna come back and talk about Lola.
Okay. So this is maybe luckily kind of answering your question. And this is chapter 21, almost at the end of the book.
It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, sorry, that was my clock there. Billy held a memory of a simple time when all seemed right in the world, a time of boyhood freedoms. Summer days were spent guddling trout up on the riverbanks and swimming in the peat-infused island streams that turned him blue as snow-packed waters ran over his skinny white body. He loved the solace in the freshness of the water. Sliding under the frigid rush, he would lie on the pebbled riverbed with a large rock held tightly to his chest, looking up through the rust-colored water. He would watch the orange orbs of sunlight that diffused like splintered diamond flecks between thousands of darting salmon and trout as they hurried to spawn upstream. Dashing dark brown digits ran over like some form of visual Morse code that he tried to decipher as the language of nature. Dot, dot, dash, dash, dot, dot. He would blow out bubbles that rose in silver orbs punctuated through the dashing fish, and then frantically at the last moment he'd push up to the surface, gasping for air. The icy water froze his head numb with physical proof that he was alive and all was right in the world he knew. Is that long enough? Yeah.
It is beautifully long enough. And the world that he knew. A changing man. But we spoke, you mentioned earlier that, you know, of all the people in his life, that the effect of meeting them, perhaps Lola
Yes.
had the biggest effect. I don't know, because at each point, but could you give us a little bit again of how he meets Lola, and what, because I don't want people not to be able to read this for themselves, but just tell us who she is to start with.
She works for Elvis, and when Billy and Elvis get together because he realizes who he is when he meets him at the concert, um, um, Lola is brought in to entertain Billy, and she's a good time girl. She's a showgirl, and when I think of her, I think of Anne Margaret, beautiful red
Yeah,
in my head, and but she has her own issues. She comes from a broken family. She has an Irish father and Cheyenne Indian mother, and she's raised out on a farm in Wyoming next to Devil's Tower, which, if you've ever been there, is one of my favorite places in the world. And there's just megalith of rock that comes out of the prairie. And I built a winery up near there, which was a lot of fun. So I used to go up and walk around and hang out there. But again, so true story, right? But she is equally lost, and in coming together between the two of them, they reveal their true selves to one another. They reveal their true stories, and one of my favorite words is vulnerability. And I think until you get to a point in your life where you truly understand the power of vulnerability, you're not alive. And not to pontificate too much on that, but that's the common thread they change. And she reveals her real name to him. She reveals her real self as he does to her. And it truly is a beautiful love story that will endure, like all great love stories do.
That makes me very, very happy. I like the notion of that in enduring. What I'd like to talk about now, if that's okay, is a little bit more about you, as the author, and about the process, but also you and your life story. So first of all, the book is published by Norlight Press, yeah?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wondered, how did you find them, or did they find you? What was the process of you putting your books to them?
Um, I was fortunate. I got introduced to Norlight Press. I do writing retreats with a group called Wellness and Writing Retreats, in Italy and Sedona in California, and we were supposed to be doing one in Africa end of the year before COVID hit. But there's a lady called Julie Colvin, dear friend of mine, lovely woman, wrote some beautiful books herself, and she had a book published with them. And so I was trying to go the traditional route and find an agent, do all the traditional stuff. And combination between that and working with editors, I got frustrated in a sense of what people wanted me to write, what they thought the story should be. So being me, I said, bugger you. think we use that word okay. I said, I'm going to go do it myself. And Julie introduced me to those guys, and they were great. They were really helpful. And probably most importantly, I retained my rights. And
Mm,
so it's a form of self publishing, a little different, but in principle the same. But most importantly for me, I got to have my own creative license, and I got to retain the rights. And the way I looked at it was test the waters, see if anyone will read it, see if it's any good. It's the biggest challenge as a writer, is sharing. I always say to people, you're not a writer until you've shared what you've written. If it's in the
mm,
drawer, it doesn't work.
mm,
So from that point of view, they've been great, and they're very low key. And it's also been good for me to learn the industry a little bit more. So I am still looking for an agent, and I'm hoping that someone reads this and said, "Oh, we'd love to have your other two books at some point." But at the same time, that's not going to stop me moving forward.
mm, mm. And you say that you work with the idea of on writing retreats and encouraging other people, and I just wonder, in the process of you doing that, have there been revelations for yourself that you've been able to incorporate in your own style process?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I don't think you can ever call yourself a teacher if you're not learning. And you know, my job, so to speak, every day. You ask my wife, and she said, I don't know what you actually really do." So I get hired by people to help them creatively, and it doesn't really matter whether it's designing a bank, building a winery. I just taught a whole bunch of executives on how to do Zoom calls. It can be rather random,
Mhm,
but at the end of all of it is I'm passionate about people finding their voice, finding their expression, and telling the stories. Because we all have them. We might want to act, we might want to sing, we might want to dance, paint. It doesn't matter, and it
mhm,
doesn't have to be good. It just has to get out. And for me, that's what writing is. If I could just keep doing this, I'd love to be sitting at home and doing that instead of having to actually go out and do real work. But that's that. I love your point about possibilities, because unless you do it, possibilities don't exist.
mhm.
And that's what makes this fun, and that's what makes it fun in conversations like this. One of my goals. I don't know if you know the poet David White. I went to
Yes, yeah.
so and he comes up around, he's from Yorkshire or something like that. But I just went to a retreat with him in Ireland just before COVID hit, and he's one of my heroes in a sense that I love what he writes. And he one of his poems called Sweet Darkness. He says, "Anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you." And it's a real interesting question to ask
Oh,
yourself, right? If you don't bring yourself alive, you're too, how do you be too small for yourself? So possibilities are infinite should you choose to take this mission. That's kind of how
mm.
and,
Ooh.
and that,
Mhm.
I mean, oh, sorry, that's what I was going to say. I went on his retreat last year. I went on several retreats. I kind of took the summer off and went around a few countries. And the reality was that my intent was only one thing. It was to have new conversations with people that I didn't know, subjects I didn't know about. And this, for me, talking to you today, is a new conversation, which is the fruit of last summer, because now I'm here having a new conversation.
Mm. And might I say to you, what an absolute pleasure it has been to spend this time with you and learn not only about how Billy Tapper Zillionaire came into being and all those different strands. There's a last strand that I just wanted to pull out, and it might bring us to a nice close of our discussion. I felt that there was a recurring motif, not necessarily in Billy, but in other characters of this desire to go back home, you know, to have gone so far and to have tried things and to have experienced things, but then to want to go back home. And I just wondered, you know, for you, is there a sense of, will there ever be a going back home? or are you still on a voyage of discovery?
By my nature, I've lived a lot of places from being very young, and so I'm always open to discovery and voyages. So I don't think it's never over. My farm that I have here, I came out to a party. I live in South Carolina, a little town called Aiken. It's a horse community. My wife is a equine therapy teacher,
Mm-hmm.
children, and I came out for a weekend and went home with a house. And it's taken us 4 years to come here, and I still am coming and going. But I very much live where I live, and again, it's gorgeous here. And I walk out, and sometimes just the 100 yards to get to my office in the barn takes me an hour because I'll go and see the goats, and I'll go see the donkey, and I'll see the horse, and that's shifted my perspective on how I want to live. And but at the same time, when I go to Italy and we do our retreats there in a little town called Nirano, which is on the Amalfi Coast, I could see myself in a white linen suit and a fedora, at the age of 80, pouncing around the streets with a little cup of coffee, you know, telling somebody, "Have you read my book?" Anyway, so one of the beautiful things is, the world is so expansive. People, places, experiences. Why constrain yourself?
Yeah.
And just to finish that point, if I may,
Mm.
it, a large part of what I'm teaching people at the moment is how to recreate connection. And because we've just learned that it can be taken away from us for the first time in modern history, we're starting to realize that connection was taken away. How do we, the people we love, the places we want to go, suddenly we couldn't. And instead of being pessimistic about that, I'd rather be optimistic and look, right, so it invariably will happen again. So let's be ready. Let's emerge into this with tools and skill sets that we can actually go, I want to learn how to keep connection. And like we're doing right now from across the transatlantic, it's there are ways to still do that, and there's ways to connect through stories and relationships that I think that's what you guys do to bring people's stories out to the market. That's creating connection, and a book is a fantastic thing to do that with.
It most certainly is. Gary, um, what I'd like to ask you is, um, can we come back then and keep this connection going? Can we come back next week and will you engage with me again, but about a different book next time? Is that okay?
That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. For now, it just remains for me, on behalf of Honey and Stag, to thank you so much, Gary, for your time with us this afternoon. I want to thank viewers for watching. I hope you have enjoyed listening to Gary Finnan talk about his work and talk about his creative process. Please, please, please follow us, Honey and Stag, on social media. We are forever looking for authors whose work is just fascinating to talk about and put out there. So emerging us not just as people who deal in crime fiction and the dark side, but all sorts of literary genre to bring to you great conversations and great books that you might not have had the chance to read yet. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.